Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with David Chaffetz. David is a regular at Asian Review of Books. He's a member of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and he is the author of a handful of books, including Raiders, Rulers, and Traders. He's traveled extensively in Asia for more than 40 years and divides his time between Lisbon and Paris. We talk about Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, which is the rise of the horse and how it worked through time with humans and with various empires. As I say in the somewhere in the conversation, when you start reading about nomadic groups or peoples, or you start reading about various empires, the Ottomans, the Mongols, and other empires in Central Eurasia, you start to see the significance of the horse and how much herding and riding and using horses for different reasons becomes important. So when I was able to come across this book, I kind of jumped on it. I was like, oh yes, there's something very specific. And so that's kind of the motivation for this conversation. Of course, David is such a lovely man. He's a wonderful person, and he wrote a fantastic book. So we talk about the origins of the horse and how long they've lived alongside humans. We talk about herding and horse milk, domesticating the horse and riding horses. We talk about the steppe environment, what that was like, the Eastern Steppe, Western Steppe, rise of chariots, the Scythians, and mounted combat, how horses were used within empires, and China's relationship with horses in ancient times. We talk about various groups and empires, the Kushans, the Turks. We talk about Chinggis Khan and the Mongols, Timur, and then all the way through some of the expansion in Central Eurasian countries, and then up to the modern period of World War I, and many other topics. Obviously horses are obviously still around with us. People still use them, but they're used less so for transportation because we have other means. It's very, very interesting, though, for how this relationship between horses and humans have been for many thousands of years. And so I found this conversation really, really interesting and stimulating in a lot of ways, because a lot of the times, people are focused on, different events that happen, and, riding on horses is just kind of a given. So it was nice to kind of turn the spotlight on a different aspect of this. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com and on YouTube. So you can get over there, subscribe, like, follow, share with your friends, contribute, and much appreciated for all of the people that do. And as always, you can find conversations that are similar to this, some of the empires and some of the different civilizations, if you will. I have had plenty of conversations with some wonderful people, so there's more to pull from this well if you like this conversation. And now I bring him, David Chaffetz. I am here with David Chaffetz. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you. So it's a big thanks.
Great to see you, Xavier.
Yeah, of course. So you have written a truly remarkable book. I was just telling you before we started, as I've gotten older, I've been reading more global history, and listeners will know I like the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and this idea of the importance of horses is super important. For many of these empires, and over the steppe, the East and Western Steppe, into Anatolia, so all these things, and I was thinking, this would be really good to have a book on why they were so important and how horses were used, and here it is. And so this is the book. It's not just about those; it covers those empires and those regions, but it's also about many other points of history. The book is called Raiders, Rulers, and Traders: The Horse and the Rise of Empires. This is out through the lovely Norton. So we'll talk all about it, which I'm very excited to do. Before we do, why don't you just give us a snapshot of who you are academically, professionally, and anything you're currently up to?
Oh, gosh. Academically, I'm a lowly Bachelor of Arts. And then I spent um, about 40 years working in technology. But that
Hmm.
gave me the opportunity to visit a lot of the countries that I talk about in the book. And
Hmm.
a combination of an undergraduate fascination with Iran and Afghanistan, which I wrote a book about in 1980, and 40 years of traveling in Asia have left me with a really deep feeling and deep obsession with the history of this part of the world.
Yeah, I get some of that. I get the pull. It's a fascinating place. You always hear about, go to Greece, go to Rome, go to southern France, and go to Spain, and all those places are great. But no one's saying go to Uzbekistan or Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan. And those places are also great as well in their own ways.
It's getting much more popular to go to Uzbekistan. A friend of mine is the
Nice.
tourism ambassador for Uzbekistan, and many
Hmm.
people I know are going there. And I really hope they read my book before they go there because it's very hard to understand why you have these magnificent monuments in the middle of nowhere unless
Mm.
you have done some historical reading. And I think my book would be a great companion for travel to that part of the world.
Yeah, I could imagine that. Yeah, it's my hope that I get there to that part of the world sooner than later. So I have your book in me, so it will definitely be a good companion.
Half the battle.
That's right. So so let's talk about, I guess, uh, the horse generally. I guess the domestication of the horse has been seen for humans as super important for many, couple of thousands of years. I guess the one thing I want to know, sort of the central thesis of the book, is by understanding the horse, how do we understand histories of human cultures and territories, as you make the case for in the book? How do you make that link?
Yeah. Well, let me start with a comparison. If you wanted to understand a lot of the things that happened in the 20th century, you would want to understand petroleum.
Mm,
It was the reason for wars, it was the reason for kingdoms to be created, it was the biggest product traded in the marketplace. And we've been living in the age of petroleum for about 150 years. We're pretty
mm,
familiar with it. So now try to imagine a world where there's no petroleum. I know we're trying to get there, but it would
hmm
be strange because all kinds of places that are important to us today would not be important anymore.
mm,
So the horse played that role for a much longer period of time, for 3,000 years, not 150 years. And without understanding the role played by the horse, it's very difficult to understand world history. First of all, there
mm,
would be no world history without the horse because the different countries and civilizations of Europe and Asia would not be in contact with another. The horses enabled the creation of these big empires that you mentioned, like the
mm,
Mongols. The horses were the biggest commodity of trade between the different peoples of Asia, similar to the way petroleum is today. And something we don't think about that much, but we might want to come back to in the end, is that the horses shaped religious practices and then cultural practices and artistic traditions. And even today, we have a fine legacy of equestrian art.
mm,
So it's sort of affected us in many, many different ways and created the world we live in today.
mm. Tell us, I guess, briefly what we know about the horse, where it comes from. I guess, kind of, sort of evolutionary origins, if you will. But really, I think you say in the book it's around 3000 BCE where humans and horses start to sort of, as much as we know, live together. And I guess that what that process is like of going from wild to domesticated has to be very interesting. I can imagine it wasn't this very linear kind of thing. It was probably a start, stop, or some groups did it this way and some groups did it this way. But yeah, just tell us generally about the horse, but then how horses and humans started to live together.
Sure. So there's a lot more agreement about the ancient history of the horse than about the domestication of the horse. Because let's say we've spent a couple hundred years looking at fossil records, whereas we're only beginning um, to explore some of the mysteries of paleogenetics, and there's many, many more things that we'll learn in the future. But going back to the beginning, the horses were originally a small mammal among the many small mammals that flourished after the age of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were wiped out, and the world became populated by um, small mammals from which we are also descended. So we're talking 50 million years ago. The earliest horse that's identified as a horse by the paleontologists is located about 50 million years ago in North America.
Mm.
And unfortunately, I made a mistake in my book because I thought that zebras and donkeys developed in the New World after the Equus moved from the New World to the Old World. But in fact, donkeys, zebras, and horses all developed in North America, crossed over to Asia when there was a land bridge, split into the three species today, the horse, the donkey, and the zebra, and covered all of Eurasia and Africa. The zebras and the donkeys specialized in hotter climates. They're essentially African animals. And so they developed further there, and the horses stayed in the temperate zone of Europe and Northern Asia. Then they all equids went extinct in the Americas. So that's important to keep in mind if you think about the American Indians and their affinity with horses, because that is a modern phenomenon, only 500 years old. So let's go back to now we have all these horses in Europe and Asia. Horses represent about a third of the animals hunted and killed in by man just as the Ice Age is over and our species began to migrate into Northern Europe. A third of the animals killed. So it was a very important source of food for us. And it's also the most common animal represented in cave painting. I was just in the south of France, a place called La Beche, and they have a remarkable series of horses painted on the caves. Well, we're seeing. We hunted these animals for 15,000 years. And at some point, and this is where the story gets very hard to read, at some point, I guess we got tired of hunting them and we started capturing the young and corralling them and continuing to butcher them. And then at some point, maybe 4,000 years ago, or rather, 4,000 BC, so 5,000 years ago, we began to exploit them for milk. Now, the important point here is that was not an aha moment, because the steppe peoples who lived where most of the horses lived had got cattle, sheep, and goats from the Middle East about 1,000 years earlier. So it wasn't illogical for them to say, hey, here's this other mammal, we can potentially exploit it for meat and milk and skin and other secondary products, just like we do with the goats, sheep, and cattle. So these people became herders of horses, cattle, sheep, and goats in a kind of combined herd, which over time has proved to be an extremely good ecological solution for living in the arid parts of Eurasia. And at some point, in order to herd large herds of horses, you had to learn to ride them, because as anybody who's ever run after a horse and tried to catch a horse, they have an advantage over us. So riding developed from the necessity of herding. And that probably happened around 3000 BC.
Yeah, I'll come to the writing in a minute, but you have herders, so it's interesting how they start to use them for milk, but that many people today in the region, the Kazakhs, the Mongols, they still use milk to this day, whereas I don't think most people, maybe other people do it here out in North America or whatever, but most of the time we're using cows and goats and stuff. But I don't know if we still use horses here for milk as much. But over there, they still do.
Right.
What is it about that tradition that continues to use horses for milk?
So horse milk is more nutritious than cow's milk. It is equally nutritious with mother's milk, according to nutritionists.
Really?
I wasn't breastfed, so I couldn't tell you. but
Huh.
it's very low in fat, and so it's kind of a superfood. It has
Interesting.
sustained horse breeding peoples in the Eurasian steppe for centuries, and there's no reason for them to give it up. Now, keep in mind that their cattle do not give as much milk as our cattle do. In Europe, where we have lots and lots of grass, I mean, basically, Denmark, for example, in the Netherlands is nothing but grass, and they raise a lot of cows, and they bred cows to be super milk producers.
Mm.
The steppe people never did that because they would never have had enough food to feed such a cow. So in Europe, we specialize in breeding cattle for milk, and of course also meat, but milk is a big part of it. And in the steppe, they have specialized in continuing to breed horses who give milk.
Hmm.
So I'm not sure that I don't know. I don't think that our horses in Western Europe and the Americas, which have been raised for optimized for saddle work, would necessarily give a lot of milk. But the Kyrgyz, Kazakh horses give enough milk to sustain their family.
Hmm. That's very interesting. I didn't know all that. That's very, very interesting to see how it's almost like a superfood. So this idea of when humans started to ride horses, I've talked to a few other people, and a lot of people. I had a conversation with Anthony Satin. He wrote a really cool book on nomads. It was a really, really good book.
Hmm.
And
This is a recent book, right?
yeah, I think it's out. It came out this
I
year.
read it and I reviewed it. Quite an interesting book. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember I had a conversation with him, and he said something like, the kind of question mark here is like, when did humans start saying like, I'm going to jump on that animal and start riding it? Like, it had to have been a process. It had to have been, and he kind of said, I'm not really sure, but I'm curious. What are your thoughts about when we first think people started to ride horses? What were the reasons, and what that, as best we know, process was like in trying to ride horses?
Right. Well, a couple of things to think about before we go into how they rode horses. One is that all agricultural people who raise animals have individuals, usually young kids, who ride those animals. So,
Mm,
people ride water buffaloes, people ride cattle, um,
hmm
people ride reindeer.
Donkeys.
Some people try to ride zebras, not successful. So, yeah, if you grow up in a pastoralist environment, jumping up on the back of an animal is not per se a big leap into the unknown. Second
hmm
thing to think about is the fact that the donkey was domesticated probably 1,000 years earlier than the horse, and people from the steppe zone where they kept all these horses were familiar with the fact that down on the south side of the Caucasus or on the south side of the Oxus River, there were people who rode donkeys for transportation. So it must have seemed like an obvious thing to do, but not an easy thing to do.
mm
So my supposition is that they were forced to try it because if you didn't ride, it would be difficult to have a very large herd. And because horses were smaller and not as strong as current horses, it was probably young kids who were lighter than humans and maybe could recover easier from falls, who would be asked to jump up on the horse and herd the horses back to the camp in the evening or keep watch over the horses when they were far away from the camp. And this was probably a very gradual process that started with incidental riding and didn't lead to extensive riding. What I mean by extensive riding is you probably couldn't stay on top of one of these horses for more than an hour at a time before you had to switch to another horse. And you probably didn't undertake any long journey. But at a
mm
certain point, a couple things happened. We got better at riding, and we specifically bred horses by culling the ornery horses to become more used to riding, less likely to be injured by riding, and more amenable to our control. So over time, the breed of horses evolved to be easier to ride, and that might have taken 1,000 years, let's say between 3,000 and 2,000 BC.
mm
I should
mm
mention, though, that a lot of scholars argue for much earlier date for writing, they would say 4000 BC, move everything back by 1,000 years. And the only reason why I didn't like just, that version of the story is that then I say to myself, well, what did they do for 1,000 years when they could ride around? They didn't go anywhere. So I'm sort of assuming that extensive writing took place in the years between 3000 and 2000. And then right after that, you suddenly see horsemanship breaking out of the steppe and becoming very common in the Middle East. So that's the reason why I suggest a later date for extensive writing. For earlier writing, it could have been a very long process. It could have started a very long time ago.
That's very interesting. Maybe give us a picture, since it's so important, kind of, overview of the steppe region and how these horses roamed these regions for many years with humans. Few places you highlight is Gobi in Mongolia, Taklamakan in Western China, places in Central Asia, places in Afghanistan, Iran. What was it, I guess, about these regions for people? I'm assuming a lot of listeners haven't been to these places. What was it about the landscape that horses were able to roam freely in this time, and with humans? Was it just very wide open, very easy? Humans were more nomadic in these regions as well, so it suited. What was it that kind of helped that kind of relationship?
Well, I think that the horses remember that we hunted horses. So at a certain point, the horse population withdrew from places where there were a lot of humans. And they went into the steppe where initially human beings couldn't really live. So it became a reserve of horses, a natural reserve of horses. And only when humans started to penetrate the steppe through the few rivers that actually go through the steppe, did they come back into contact with these horses, and where the process of domestication probably took place. So it's Ukraine and southern Russia where you have these very long rivers, and on those riverbanks, when horses came down to drink water, which they are when they're very thirsty animals, initially humans hunted them and butchered them, and later on they domesticated them. So the humans and the horses began a symbiotic relationship in the steppe. So without the horse, the man could not live in the steppe.
Mm. Mm.
There was not enough. There was not enough rainfall to support agriculture. There was not enough. There was not enough flora and fauna to support a hunter-gathering lifestyle or a very poor hunting-gathering lifestyle. It would have been not the choicest place for human settlement. But with domestication of the horse, the steppe became an excellent environment for humans who had become horse breeders.
It's very interesting. So as people begin to interact with horses, both in herding and riding, you fast forward us and you start talking about the kind of introduction of the chariot, which is interesting. People will, have, they've seen certain movies or, certain books or stories and kind of know about chariots from a while ago. But chariots were pretty interesting in a lot of ways. It was not just the fact of using them kind of practically, but also there was something about a type of symbol or status or being well-trained warriors. What are all the elements of chariots with horses and what that was for many people groups symbolizing, and the practical uses of using horses with the chariots?
That's a really interesting question, because many people point out that chariots are pretty lousy way to get around, especially on the steppe, because you can't go up or down a hill with more than a 26-degree angle. You can't ride over stony ground. You can't really ride through sand. So whoever rode around on the steppe in a chariot, I think, was pretty brave. But like you say, it looked good, and the archaeological finds show that people spent a lot of effort to decorate the chariot to make it look impressive, and also to cover it with things that would make noise, so that when the big man mounted in his chariot and drove out, everyone knew it was happening. So it was kind of a prestige. It was certainly a prestige item for chiefly warriors in the steppe, and you get that sense from reading the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, where the big heroes are driven into battle by their drivers. But keep in mind, they don't fight in chariots. They simply get to the battlefield and then they get out and they engage in combat. So they didn't use chariots in this period as the way we might think of tanks. They used them as armored personnel carriers. Okay, but then the chariot drivers of Central Asia, the people we think of today as being the nomads, they were in contact with the big civilizations of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, and they quickly got jobs there as mercenaries and as trainers and coaches of local chariot armies. And according to the Bible, when the Egyptians and the people from the Fertile Crescent went to war, and a lot of those wars took place, as you know, in Syria and in the land of Israel, they were massive chariot armies with supposedly 5,000 chariots on a side. Only a very wealthy, very well-organized kingdom like Egypt could possibly put together a chariot army like that. And I guess in the flatter lands, this part of the world, that was something that could be you could contemplate giving battle on chariot and using the chariot effectively like tanks today. This, we're talking now about 2000 BC, 1800 BC, and about 500 years later, the same technology reached China, and we're startled to see that the early Chinese chariots looked identical to chariots in the Middle East. It shows that there was not a fast, but a very direct technology a transfer from the Middle East to China via the steppe.
One of the interesting people groups that I have kind of read about in more recent years, and it was really nice to see them get featured in your book, of course, are the Scythians. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Chris Beckwith wrote a great book on the Scythian Empire. I think he's kind of the expert on this, and it's very, very, very good. He has to know so many languages, both dead and living.
Yes, many.
The Scythians are very interesting. Could you talk about them just generally, but how they influenced the Huns and the Turks and the Mongols, like what the impact was on learning how to ride and shoot? This becomes, I think most people see this as very distinct for Mongolia, but there's a kind of precursor here of sorts with the Scythians, and there's a lot of admixture here of in Iran and things like that. So down the road, but yeah, just tell us about them and their impact on horses and riding and shooting.
Sure. The Scythians are identified in history as the people who really made mounted combat a big deal for the world, because they had a number of inventions that made them very formidable and basically put the chariot out of business. So let's just go down them one by one. They invented what I call in the book the Cupid bow. It's also called a reverse bow. So it's a bow that curls outward, and when you string it, you have to sort of reverse the curve, and that puts tremendous tension on the bow. And what's good about such a bow is that it's very short, and if you're on horseback, it fires with as much power as what we would call a long bow that takes up very little room. You can just swing it over your saddle and ride with it. Whereas with a long bow, it's very awkward in the saddle. You can't switch from one side to the other, and you can't easily do what we call the Parthian shot, which is to turn in the saddle and shoot with it. So the name Scythian itself probably comes from an ancient Iranian word meaning the archers. What's interesting is many, many years later, when the Mongols invaded the Middle East, the Armenians, who had a bad experience with the Mongols, called them the nation of archers. So this concept that these people are essentially mounted archers started with the Scythians and continued
Mm.
for another 800 years.
Mm.
So let's look at the other innovations of that we owe to the Scythians. They invented the padded saddle. Before that, people
Mm-hmm.
rode bareback. They invented trousers, which obviously made it easier to stay in the saddle longer. And more importantly, they invented better snaffle. They invented better bits, which includes the snaffle bit, which gives you much more delicate control over the horse's mouth. And they bred bigger and brawnier horses, which were capable of extensive um, marches for military purposes and fairly frightening attacks. So they created this complex of cultural and technological elements that made them very formidable in warfare. They were hired as mercenaries by many of the um, sedentary empires. They were part of the Persian cavalry. They were part of the Indian empires that they grew up. Also hired Scythians. And what's interesting is that they were the police in the city of Athens. So Euripides in his comedies makes fun of the fact that they don't speak Greek very well. You wouldn't want to be arrested by a mounted archer, I don't think. So this cultural complex that they put together was so effective that a lot of other people tried to imitate it. So of course, I mentioned that the settled people hired Scythians, but then the people who lived in the forest zone north of the steppe, they were talking about Siberia, Mongolia, and Manchuria. These people essentially came out of the forest and adapted the Scythian lifestyle. They learned to ride horses, they learned to shoot, and um, either we don't know from an ethnic point of view, they either assimilated into the Scythians or the Scythians
Mm-hmm.
assimilated into them. But at some point, we find the Scythians reduced to a very small number of people in the Western steppe. Today, they're the Ossetian people in the Caucasus. They're the modern descendants, speaking the descendant of the language spoken by the Scythians. There's a few
Mm.
others scattered around the world. But in the eastern steppe, um, the Huns replaced the Scythians, followed by the Turks, followed by the Khitans, who then disappeared, followed by the Mongols, and finally followed by the Manchus. And there were many others, and you have to be a little bit careful not to essentialize these people because in some
Mm-hmm.
cases they simply changed names
Mm.
or they adopted the name of a nearby people. So um, we shouldn't think too much about who they were from a language or an ethnic point of view. What we know is they had a very homogeneous lifestyle,
Mm.
um, and we can identify this continuity of lifestyle over thousands of years.
Mm. Yeah, it's again, they're very interesting in how they have a lot of influence and impact. You talk about how horses become significantly in use for empires, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Kind. So many different empires are using horses, maybe in similar ways, but in different ways. How did we start to see horses really be used within empire? Was it in battle and conflict? Was it for at this point trade? How did or other symbols of status? How were horses, I guess, being used for some of these empires that were kind of rising and falling in this period?
Yeah. Well, I mean, initially, I think the key impetus for adapting horses from the steppe people was for warfare. They first did it for chariots, and then when the Scythians showed up, then they said, "Yeah, well, that's we want one of those." So they started hiring Scythian cavalrymen, and the Assyrians, who were the first empire in the Middle East to really deploy cavalry, started off with Scythian or Median or Iranian cavalrymen, and then learned basically to raise their own horses and and indigenize their cavalry forces. They were defeated eventually by the Medes and the Persians simply because Iran is a much better country for raising horses than Assyria. And in fact, the Iranians have always called Iran as the land of good horses. So Iran became a kind of a horse superpower and wound up conquering the biggest empire that the world had ever known at that point, absorbing the Assyrians, the Egyptians, the Anatolians, and plowing all the way to the boundaries of India. So the only thing is, though, that they had to develop a bureaucracy for managing these forces because they deployed such a large cavalry over such a great distance. And then you get into the kind of other infrastructure benefits of horses. They instituted a postal service so that messages could be carried from the Aegean Sea to the Persian capital in Persepolis in a matter of weeks instead of months. And they developed a sophisticated procedure for breeding horses, for branding horses, for selecting the best horses for different categories of work. And they ran very big stud farms all over the empire. So this is something very new and something that steppe people don't do and they don't have to do because steppe people just raise herds of horses in a semi-wild state, whereas Persian Empire established this system of breeding and raising war horses in a very systematic way. And that system was then subsequently adapted by all the other empires. And the big difference between the settled empires and the steppe people is stabled horses or horses that are kept under constant surveillance versus left to pasture in the wild.
It's interesting, kind of what you were saying about in the beginning, how we really can't see, a time in our current day with oil, right? I would even say technology at this point in a more modern sense of things. Imagine a time without, certain types of technology, or imagine a time without oil. And as horses become involved in empires and within cultures of this time, you do start to see here it's impacting all parts of their life, and they are becoming kind of a staple of interactions with humans here. You move us in the book to the varied uses of horses with China's first emperor. They use them with chariots, but you talk about some challenges they had in breeding them. You talk about how the Huns monopolized this relationship with horses and began to finally understand breeding horses. In China in this period, how did they start to look at this relationship with horses and start to use them?
Yeah, well, the Chinese were in a very different position from the Iranians because China, the core area of China is a horse poor country. It has poor conditions for raising horses. They don't have the right climate. It's too hot and wet. They don't have the right fodder. Their grass doesn't provide the kind of minerals that grass on the steppe provides. Another important part is that because already in those days, the population of China was the biggest settled population in the world. There were twice as many Chinese as there were inhabitants of the Roman Empire. The farmers took over all the available land. So even if you could grow fodder for horses, or if you could have pastures for horses, at some point the pressure from the farmers would turn that land over for cultivation. So China was forced into a continual dependency on the steppe people to obtain horses. And because horses were not native to China, they were also dependent on the steppe people to run the horse bureaucracy for them. So they were the grooms, they were the masters of cavalry, they were the generals of cavalry, and Chinese were in this terrible position where they had to rely on people who were potentially their enemies to run the whole system for providing the empire with horses.
It's interesting how you see the evolution of how different places and different people groups are trying to find different ways of understanding and tackling this issue of how do we use them best. We have a problem and then we try and use it. We might have to incorporate some things. We find our own way of doing it. It's very interesting. You talk about the Kushans and how they really contribute to the evolution of the modern horse. Of course, there's been much that's been talked about with the Silk Roads and all that in terms of trade. You can talk about that here if you want, but maybe tell us about the Kushans and how they really pushed for the evolution of how we kind of know and see horses, or have some idea of it even until the modern horse.
Sure. So let's step back a second. The Kushans are basically Scythians. One of the things I tried to do in the book is not spend too much time on ethnology because it's a book about horses. It's not a book about tribes and peoples. But sometimes you have to introduce a name because otherwise no one can find a reference to these people. And Kushan art is very famous, and the Kushans are the great patrons of Buddhism. And so there's a number of reasons why I had to say Kushans, but let's keep in mind that the Kushans were Scythians. Beckworth makes a big deal about the fact that everyone is a Scythian, so I'm kind of in that line of thinking. So the Kushans found themselves in what's probably one of the best places in the world to raise horses, which is northern Afghanistan, the plains around the city of Balkh, which is today Mazar-e-Sharif. And then just north of that, what's now in Uzbekistan, and the Fergana Valley. And these places were, even in antiquity, famous for having the best horses. Now, what does it mean, the best horses? A typical horse in China would have been 13 hands high, which is about 130 centimeters. Sorry, I can't translate that into feet or inches.
You're good.
Okay. But in Fergana, horses would routinely grow to be much bigger because two reasons. One is they get a very nutritional food. And second of all, because the Kushan bred them carefully, they didn't ride them that early, and they waited for them to get taller before riding them, which turned them into much more impressive beasts. And so now we're talking about horses that might have been 16 or 17 hands high, which is about the size of a racehorse today. But in ancient times, such horses were very rare and very, very expensive. So they turned this into a business and they began to supply horses to the Empire of China. And this made them extremely wealthy and powerful. The Iranians, Persians kept on trying to take them out because they didn't like the fact that these people were selling so many horses. The Iranians, as I said, had good horses, and so they would have liked to be the main emporium for horses, but the Kushans were doing better. And the Kushans then expanded their domain past Afghanistan into northern India, and they found that in India, too, the various rulers also wanted to buy big, powerful horses. So they had that market as well. So the combination of these two markets, India and China, gave them the impetus to breed horses pretty scientifically. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by breeding them more scientifically. Once they developed a desirable trait in a horse, for example, the ability to amble, which is one of the gaits that not all horses can do, they would breed that ambling horse, very comfortable pace for riding long distances. They'd breed that ambling horse, and they would cull the other horses, or they would geld the males and not use them for breeding. So over time, they wound up. You can sort of see this in paintings from the time. They wound up with horses which were a single color, and that's really important because if you look at horses, dogs, cats, if they breed without human control, the coats of these animals tend to be multicolored, like calico cats. whereas purebred animals tend to have single coat color. And that what happened to the Kushans. They were able to produce horses with distinctive coat colors, and I think they sold them kind of as branded merchandise. So they had a great color, and the buyer took the coat color as a signal for other attractive traits, and that led to the emergence of today's modern breed.
Mm. Mm. Is this something that you think was definitely intentional, or is this something that was like a kind of surprising accident of sorts? It's like, oh yeah, we're breeding, but we're not sure we're going to get it this way. What do you think about this?
I think it was I think it was intentional, and this
Mm.
breeding for a desirable trait has been going on since people first started to ride horses, and even before. The first thing we called horses for was how much milk they give. If a mare didn't give a lot of milk or wouldn't allow herself to be milked, we kill it and eat it. Later on, we killed and ate animals that wouldn't allow themselves to be ridden, or were too weak to be ridden. So we're constantly either eating animals or gelding them so that they don't reproduce. And so we're selecting maybe one stallion out of 10 for breeding. And that stallion had to have the characteristic that people wanted. And then indirectly, they wound up with homogeneous coat colors because they were descended from lineages that have this particular color.
It's super interesting how, again, this every different points, different people groups are making kind of their mark on how humans interact with horses, intentionally or unintentionally, which is really, really interesting. Just real quick, just something about the Turks, which is interesting. You kind of talk about how they get credit for the saddle tree, and how we know that they came to be the ones that get the credit for it. You also talk about a Turkish steppe epic, the book of Dede Korkut, and this was interesting in knowing hunting with horses. I guess the question here is generally, what's the kind of Turks, thumbprints, if you will, on the interaction with horses? Some Turks are known to be nomadic, and so there's some interesting pieces there. But also how we understand, riding and hunting, and there's stories, epics about horses and things like that, or not exclusively, but they're involved. You're starting to see as we go through time, different people groups are looking and finding different ways of using horses and interacting with them. And maybe just tell us loosely the Turks kind of print here on this.
Sure. The 9th century Arab geographer Yaqubi, I think, said that the Turks were the greatest horse people of all time. And by the way, he said that the Kushans were the second greatest horse people of all time. So it's nice that you put the Kushans and the Turks back to back, because the world, at least in the 9th century, thought that they had really solved the horse problem. So the Turks made a lot of advances in riding per se. They invented the saddle tree, as you mentioned, replacing the padded saddle that had existed previously. The problem with the padded saddle is all the weight of the rider is on one or two vertebrae on the horse. And by putting 2 sticks of wood on both sides of the horse and putting a saddle on top of that, you distribute the weight of the rider onto 4 vertebrae, 5 vertebrae, and it makes it much more comfortable for the horse. What's interesting is that you didn't mention stirrups, which everyone is so fascinated by, because to this day, no one can pinpoint to exactly who invented the stirrups. We know the Turks did not invent them, but you couldn't use stirrups without the Turkish style saddle, because the padded saddles would not have been strong enough to support the saddle stirrups, the stirrup straps. So, so somehow or another, the stirrup seemed logical once you had a rigid saddle. One thing to keep in mind about the Turks and also the Mongolians is that their traditional steppe riding is very different from that of the Iranians or other settled people. They go fast and they go far, but they don't turn that much. They don't train their horses to be to combat in a melee, to caracole, to rise up on their back, on their hind legs, to jump over obstacles. It's much more everyday going places. They don't use spurs, and you see this pretty long saddle blankets, and the reason for that is they don't want the legs to give the horse any direction. So they really have a fairly simplified riding tradition, which is very effective for the huge distances which the Turks and the Mongols would have had to cover in the steppe. The Iranians, on the other hand, are responsible for a lot more of what you'd call modern equestrian art, and also the Iranians probably invented polo, which is an example of a way of using horses, which requires a huge amount of training on both the riders and the horse's part. So, you mentioned Dedi Korkut, and what comes out of the steppe epic of Dedi Korkut is that these people spent their whole lives hunting. When they were not fighting, they were hunting, and these hunts could last for weeks at a time. And according to Dede Korkut, these hunts could last for months at a time. That was sort of epic exaggeration that people would go off on a hunt and they would be gone for a year. So they spent months in the saddle, and the rigid saddle, the stirrups, the saddle blanket, all those things made such epic hunts possible. It would have been very difficult to do that kind of hunting in the time of the Scythians on your padded saddle.
It's just so interesting how, again, the relation, everything kind of builds on itself before knowing or unknowingly, but how some people push it further.
That's right.
In a lot of ways. So obviously, if you're going to talk about nomadic groups or empires or all these places, you obviously have to talk about the mighty Chinggis Khan, and how he really used horsepower in his conquest. And you talk about something interesting with Chinggis, which is combining hunting and with military expeditions. So we just talk generally about Chinggis Khan, but then this piece that you highlight about hunting with military expeditions is very interesting.
Sure. I just want to go back to something you said about how everything builds on what came before. So Chinggis Khan is somebody who studied history very carefully, and also, let's say, military strategy very carefully, and he built consciously on his predecessors in the steppe. And you just see his success as the rational outcome of doing everything right and avoiding doing anything wrong, compared to what people had done before him. So his success, as you say, is just an taking one more step along the path trodden by other people. So, yeah, his view of military strategy does have a lot to do with the hunt, because in the Turco-Mongol hunt, the strategy is not to run after the animals and have them run away. The strategy is to make them feel there's no danger, but to surround them in a very, very big loop and then push them slowly into a trap where they can be slaughtered. And this is what Genghis Khan did to his human enemies. It's called, that strategy in Mongolian is called the nerge, and in English we use the French word to describe it, which is the battu. Because when hunters go out on foot in the forest in France with their guns, they will try to surround the prey in a circle. I guess in America we call it a turkey shoot. So that's, let's say, from a tactical point of view, how Genghis Khan used the technology of the hunt, the practices of the hunt, to defeat his enemies. But at another level, Genghis Khan was used was very strategic in his use of horse ecology. He only really fought where horses could be deployed in large numbers because they were dependent on forage on grass that they could eat on the campaign. So, for example, the Mongol armies advanced over a hugely wide front, 50 to 100 miles. Because if they had advanced on a narrow front, the horses in the front would have eaten all the grass. The horses in the back would have gotten no grass. So these large fronts were partly imposed on him by the limitations of grass for the horses to eat. But then they also fit into this idea of the battue of the encircling hunt, because when he would bring these extreme left and extreme right wings together behind the enemy was surprised and the enemy was trapped. So hunting was how he delivered the knockout blow, but the wide front on which he advanced was driven by ecological considerations.
Yeah, you're illustrating again my I know that there's a lot of many things written about the Mongol Empire and about Chinggis Khan, about the brutality and on all of the awful murder and things like that. And I don't want to minimize that by any means, but there is also a tremendous amount of organization and administrative might over millions of acres with these portable cities that were just a feat of human accomplishment. And in terms of a continuous empire at one time, I think the Mongol Empire is one of the largest. So it's definitely something to not just, to have a very one-dimensional way of looking at it. Like, oh yeah, they killed a bunch of people and that was terrible. It's like, of course it is. And it's also interesting the other things that were going on as well. So this piece of how tactical he was and methodical he was with the component here with horses is really fascinating at the very least. You talk, continuing with the same thread here. Timur used horses for breeding and trade, and continuing this legacy of the Mongols so much further after Chinggis, a couple hundred years. But how did he build off of that? They have this big empire, and then he's towards the end of it. How did he use horses for when he was in reign? Many things have been talked about Timur in terms of unifying China and the Islamization and things like that. But with the horses piece, what is the component here?
So Timur, I would say the difference between him and Genghis Khan is that Genghis Khan is a pure product of the steppe. He grew up in the center of Mongolia. He had not that much contact with settled peoples, and you could imagine an empire where the horsemen ruled the empire. Keep it simple. Our power flows from having a lot of horses. We'll rule those countries where there are a lot of horses, and we'll extract taxes from or protection money from all the kingdoms around us where we don't want to actually graze our horses. So the Mongol Empire had the advantage of simplicity. Timur came from what is today Uzbekistan, culturally, historically very close to Iran. And he was in much closer contact with the settled peoples of Central Asia and Iran. And so his view of the world was partly that he was the successor to Genghis Khan, but also partly that he was Shah of Iran and saw the creation of impressive cities as part of his legacy. So he's left us Samarkand, which is indeed a very remarkable a jewel of architecture, and was a garden of arts, music, and poetry, which is kind of hard to reconcile with the reputation that Timur has. He was much more of a urban figure than Genghis Khan. He also combined some aspect of the Mongol art of war with Iranian art of war. He raised horses in stables. We talked about that before, how the Iranians had bigger, stronger, more trained horses doing more complicated things. So whereas the Mongols simply overwhelmed the enemy with a huge number of horses deployed over a very big field, um, the art of war in Timur's time was much more scientific. He used combined forces. He used infantry. He used artillery. He used horses, and his cavalry maneuvers were probably more similar to that of European armies in the 18th century than to Timur's massive battues in the 12th century. So, um, having said that, horses were essential to Timur because of um, the huge theater of operations he operated on. For example, Timur fought battles, close to Moscow, and then rode it all the way back to Samarkand. So I said that he had infantry, but it's important to note that his infantry rode horses to get the battle, and then they fought on foot. And Timur combined those foot soldiers with his cavalry, with his artillery. So it's a very scientific, a very complex army with much more sort of modern rules of command, signaling with flags, very similar to an army in even in the American Civil War. But horses constituted a huge part of his fighting force. And when he made these raids in Anatolia, in Russia, in India, one of the main things he carried away as booty was horses, because on the one hand, he wanted to have more horses than his enemies, and on the other hand, he took the best horses in order to continue to breed great horses, and Iranian horses of that period were famous and sold as far away as China.
Yeah, it's very tactical in some ways. It does sound very close to modern military tactics and using it. It's just very fascinating.
Very close.
You talk about, you mentioned Russia there. During the 16th and 19th centuries, how did horses continue to drive Russian expansion deeper into Eurasia and seeing some of the, obviously this gets us closer to more modern history of sorts, but what was their role with Russia and that continued expansion?
Yeah. So if we go back a second, the Mongols conquered a very large empire, but they did not want to settle or pasture their horses in areas where there was not a lot of grass. So Moscow is in the forested zone. It's north of the steppe and west of the steppe. And the Grand Dukes of Moscow became tax collectors for the Mongols, paid essentially tribute for the privilege of not being invaded and sacked by the Mongols. And this continued under the Golden Horde, which was the successor of the Mongol Empire. Yep. And Timur and the Golden Horde at various times came to blows. So the Muscovites were deeply involved in the wars of Timur and in the diplomacy around the Golden Horde. But they were somewhat passive because you look at the area around Moscow, there was no way they were going to develop a big cavalry. However, a cavalry force came into Moscow's control by a combination of sort of accidental factors. There were a lot of Christian peasants who lived at the edge of the Golden Horde who were neither under control of Muscovy nor the other big Christian power of the time, the combined entity of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They had fled from control by the Grand Dukes, or they were religious schismatics, or they were crooks. I hope my Ukrainian friends won't mind my saying this, but for one reason or another, they formed a kind of wild population on the boundary between the Golden Horde, Russia, and Poland, Lithuania. And this rowdy crowd became horsemen and adopted a lifestyle which is almost the same as that of the Golden Horde. They raised horses. They wore Tatar clothes. They shaved their heads and kept the top knot, so that when they were killed in battle and you cut their heads off, you could tie their top knot to your saddle, which is the same thing that the Turks and the Mongols of the Golden Horde did. So they looked like and they rode like the Turco-Mongols, but they were Christian. And eventually they came under the control of the Tsar of Moscow. And he used these peoples to conquer the steppe from the Golden Horde and its successor state. And of course, I'm talking about the Cossacks. What's interesting is the word Cossack is a Turco-Mongolian word meaning bandit. So for my Kazakh friends, they had revolted from the Golden Horde, and I guess as a kind of an irony, they called themselves Kazakhs, but the original meaning is the bandit. So the Russian Cossack turned into a very powerful horsepower in southern Russia, today's Ukraine, and they pushed back the frontier of the steppe nomads in order to conquer the first Ukraine, the Crimea, what is today southern Russia, the northern Caucasus, until they were at the frontiers of Central Asia, the frontiers of the lands of Timur. And this took about 200 years. So the last act of this is in the second half of the 19th century, when the Russians used the Cossacks to take over the rest of Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Khiva. Very long, very bloody wars. And eventually there are no more independent steppe nomads in Central Asia. And by the way, the Chinese have done the same thing coming from the other side. And you have the frontiers, well, of the Soviet Union and China, where there's no independent steppe peoples.
So it's very interesting how it kind of spills into history that feels a little bit more recent. You mentioned towards the end of the book how horses were used in World War I and how things changed with the use of horses in wars after World War I. So we don't see horses used as much in wars, at least in some wars. I mean, there are some wars where they're still used, but were used after. But things become more modern. We have airplanes, and we have boats, and we have vehicles and tanks and all these things. And so the horse is a little bit not used as much, I guess. But tell us about what was so critical about World War I use of horses, and then what happened subsequently.
Sure. So horses were primarily used for mobility in warfare. On the Western Front in France, there was no mobility after 1914. So there was cavalry, but they quickly realized that they didn't need the cavalry, and cavalry was sent elsewhere. In the East, and in Palestine, and in Iraq, where there were no long trench lines, horses were used very extensively in World War I. The British won a decisive battle against the Ottoman Turks in Palestine, called the Battle of Megiddo. And one of the big parts of this battle was a breakthrough by the Australian and Indian cavalry, which went way around the Turkish lines, which is what cavalry is for, and rode into Damascus before the Turks knew what had hit them. But a very important innovation took place during that battle. Under the guidance of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, the British also used airplanes to attack Turkish formations and to prevent the Turks from retreating. And it's a very awful description that T.E. Lawrence gives of the retreating Turks, but it's exactly what happened to the Iraqis in Desert Storm, if you remember that. So after the war, T.E. Lawrence advised the Colonial Office that airplanes would do the job much better than several regiments of cavalry, because just a handful of airplanes can do untold damage to the enemy's troop movement. So then in 1919, a year after the war ended in Europe, the king of Afghanistan decided to invade India. Let's not get into why he did that or whether that was a good idea. But typically, the British would have mobilized cavalry to stop an invasion of India. They would have mobilized the Bengal Lancers and all these storied regiments. But they didn't. For one thing, those regiments were very under strength because of the losses during the war. And for another thing, the terrain which the Afghans used to invade India was very difficult deploying cavalry. But the British deployed aircraft. And it was devastating for the Afghans. They had never come under air fire before. The British bombed Kandahar and Kabul and terrified the government of Afghanistan into asking for peace. And that really convinced everybody that in the long run, there was no future for cavalry. So in 1923, there was an article in the Times of London where one of the military experts said, "Do we still need cavalry?" And he answered by saying, in the long run, no, but in the short run, as long as we don't have enough airplanes and enough trucks and enough tanks, we'll probably not be able to get rid of cavalry from one day to the next. So on the Western Front in World War II, again, the Germans, French did not extensively use cavalry. When America, Canada, Britain invaded France in 1944, there was no cavalry because we had plenty of trucks and tanks and airplanes. On the Eastern Front, there were still lots of horses and cavalry, simply because the Soviet and the German military machines were not capable of producing enough tanks, trucks, and aircraft. But it was simply a matter of time before everybody could replace their mounted units with armored units and to put airplanes into commission, and the writing was on the wall. So I think the writing was on the wall in 1919. It had a long tail. But horses are of no military use anymore. And because they're of no military use anymore, the significance of horses, their prestige, all the things we've been talking about in this talk, has vanished.
It's really interesting. So the future, what is the future of horses? How do they continue? What's their use, or how are they used as we have a modern age? Do they just become kind of put to the background and to just use recreationally or for other things for farming? Or what do you think is the future of how horses and humans interact?
So there are a lot of horses today in America and in the United Kingdom. There's a huge number of people enthusiastic about horses. We didn't talk too much about the human-horse social connection and how we bond with these animals. I think we bond with horses in a way that really outdistances the way we bond with other animals, other domesticated animals. And so people keep horses because they love them, even if they don't ride them, by the way. People just love horses. They're beautiful, and they're great companions. And you see a lot of horse therapy. My nephew, for example, provides horse therapy to troubled young people, and it's apparently extremely effective. I think this ancient prestige and religious aspect of the horse has stayed with us, and it's become part of our sociability, and so we will always have horses.
It's interesting how you're right that there is this kind of connection, and how we can sometimes feel or find the connection with another animal, even if we can't have practical uses from them. It's not just about practical use. I mean, it's still an organism. It's still an animal that has a lot of potential worth and value on its own. And so I think it's nice that they're not used in war anymore. That's terrible. But that they can have other uses of companionship, or even some really good supportive features as well. I think that's always wonderful to know with any animal, and especially with humans, that has had a long, or horses with humans, it's had a long history. David, this has so much fun. I really, really enjoyed your book. I really enjoyed our conversation. You have such a really nice way of explaining all of these things, all these various weaving in and out of histories, and much like how the book is as well. And it's been such a delight and a joy to talk with you. And I'm truly grateful for you coming on and talking to us all about horses and the history with us as humans.
It was a great pleasure, Xavier. I really appreciated all the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.